and his work on mediology of literature and on narratology has had a great impact on cultural studies in general. And especially his book Wahrheit und Erfindung, Grundzüge einer allgemeinen Erzähltheorie, that was also published in English in 2018 under the title Fact and Fiction, Elements of a General Theory of Narrative, is a book that you can find all over our department here on every table, I would say. It's an important milestone for popular culture studies as well. His contribution to our conference will thus be a narratological one. In his keynote lecture, he will explore the mode of suspense in storytelling. We have had quite some discussion on this point, so I'm really curious to hear what he has to say. Normally, Albrecht Koschorke is located really close to Zurich in Konstanz as a professor of German literature and literary studies. But right now he's joining us from California, from Berkeley, and I think it's 9 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much for joining us. From there, one last remark. He, of course, published much more than his books on mediology and storytelling. His last publications are a book on Hegel, Hegel und Wir, was published with Suhrkamp, and an essay on Hitler's Mein Kampf, published in German with Mattes und Seitz, and also in English with the title On Hitler's Mein Kampf, The Poetics of National Socialism, published in 2017. So thank you very much, Albrecht Koschorke, for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I would like to admit from the start that I have only some improvised remarks, and it's not particularly on spoilers, but on suspense. Yeah. So let me start with an anecdote. Years ago, sorry, I have to. Yeah. Years ago, I attended an Easter service in a mega church somewhere on the outskirts of Chicago. It was an impressive multimedia event with the choir singing gospels, movie snippets, a light show, and even artificial fog on the stage at the place where the altar used to be. When at the climax of the show, the pastor exclaimed, "Christ is risen, he is risen indeed," the thousands of churchgoers who crowded the huge storehouse-like building started cheering, shaking hands, congratulating, and hugging each other. At that time, Corona was still a Mexican beer, and even dancing around. The air was full of joy. However, something seemed weird to me. Since Good Friday is neither a federal holiday in the United States, nor a very important day in the liturgical calendar, at least not in the Pentecostal church in which I found myself, there hadn't been any solemn occasion to collectively commemorate Jesus' crucifixion 3 days before. Yet in order to be celebrated as resurrected, he would have to be mourned as suffering and dying in the first place. In Catholic regions, people fast and refrain from eating meat between Ash Wednesday and Easter Friday. Pious Christians even used to ritually weep every morning during Lent, something my mother did when I was a child. Even though the Easter service included a movie describing the crucifixion in some drastic detail, this seemed to me both a bit belated and somewhat too rushed. So in a way, at least according to my expectations, the churchgoers were deprived in a way from any true Easterly joy because they only were given the second half of the ritual, only the happy ending without an extended period of mourning before. This omission is no spoiler, of course, but it does cut into the story of redemption and hope. It takes out its contrasts and flattens how it's experienced. It does not by prematurely disclosing its outcome, but by skating over the over the counterpoint, the contrasting middle part of the story that makes the outcome meaningful in the first place. You could say it's an inverse way of damaging the effectiveness of a story, reducing it to its happy ending, but leaving out the dramatic event that gets there. At the same time, it reminds us that the way of destroying the story we think of when we are talking about spoilers is not applicable in this case. The passion story is structured around turning points, indeed extremely spectacular ones from life to death and back to life, yet there is nothing in it that a spoiler could spoil. Anyone who is open to the message of the Gospels knows that at their center stands Christ's triumphal resurrection. But even the full awareness of this doesn't prevent true believers from going through days of sorrow and shared suffering during Lent year after year. Spoilers are defined as the undesirable disclosure of one or several decisive plot elements of a story. If these elements are disclosed, they deprive the story's now all too well-informed receivers from experience and affect, which is at the same time tormenting and sensuous, suspense. However, in texts like the Easter Gospel, there are no moments of suspense and surprise that can be flattened out by prematurely disclosing how they come to an end. It's pointless to reveal the secret of a revealed religion. By definition, the truth is already known. But that doesn't impair the forcefulness of the narration. To the contrary, holy text may be based, as in this case, on a one-time historical event, but as canonized scripts of a ritual being repeated time and again, they have their own temporality. Although they follow a determined sequence in which every detail has its place, there is no temporal gradient, as it were. While the plot is evolving, its parts from beginning to end are simultaneously co-present. Such stories captivate their audience not by withholding a key piece of information and thus creating an imbalance within the narrative, but by a sequentialized recollection and representation, in the German sense of Vergegenwärtigung, of what is eternally there. Rituals generally have a circular structure, and their cultural efficacy is based on their repeated reenactment. So we can establish a first conceptual distinction between circular plots and those who are directed or linear. Only linear plots are able to produce effects of suspense and are consequently prone to possible spoilers. I have to add, however, that this distinction is by no means clear-cut. Even the consumption of directed narratives, such as novels or feature films, can take on the circular character by being often repeated. I will come back to that later. Ritualistic narratives or narrated rituals are by far not the only subgenre of stories that are indifferent to spoiler attacks. There are lots of other examples. Take fairy tales. You can't seriously spoil them by letting their audience preemptively know that the hero will finally kill the dragon and marry the king's daughter. Or take other completely conventionalized plot structures. However, it is not only because they are predictable that the concept of suspense, including its psychological implications, doesn't apply to these kinds of stories. A deeper reason lies in their being structured by a different kind of motivation and even causality. Let me explain what I mean. First, we should note that there are three basic linkages between narrative elements, or knots, articulated in the conjunctions and, then, and because. A text consisting of a mere addition or a pure sequence of elements will have difficulty passing as a narrative. Inventories, lists, timetables, and to some extent chronicles as well, mark a lower limit of narrative organization. Even if they form the very base of narration, sequences put together in the then mode appear to lack something, as if they were underdetermined. Temporal sequence presses past itself toward causal connection. At least in modern times, it seems implausible to describe a sequence of events without attributing to it some kind of implied causality, that is, to use an expression of Fritz Breithaupt, on the go. Causality on the go. Thus, juxtaposition tends to transform itself into causality, post hoc into propter hoc, although the causality might be unspecific and ambiguous. In general, because linkages in narrative make do with weak motivation. The elixir of narration consists precisely of this interference in the not fully determined zone between the linkages modalities. For just like the pure and then sequences, strict causal junctures are in the end not of a narrative nature. An unfolding mathematical proof hardly lends itself to presentation as a narrative. The spinning of a tale lives from the background possibility of an alternative linkage, which is to say of another possible sequence, hence of weakened motives and causalities that have been unsettled by countervailing forces. And it is precisely the availability of alternatives, the fact that things could turn out otherwise, that makes a story potentially suspenseful. I should add that causality in itself is a historically protein category, more an umbrella concept than one possessing stable validating criteria. In particular, we need to distinguish between two temporal directions of a conceivable causal relationship, between causa efficiens and causa finalis, between explanation on preceding rounds or a goal that needs to be realized. This is relevant to narrative theory in that stories can be motivated by a beginning or by an end. What is here causal in the more narrow sense is an embedding of the plot in a context of cause and effect. This contrasts with finality in the sense of motivation by a governing principle taking in the frame of action a numinous authority. Invoking Clemens Lugowski, specialists in narrative have shown how with increasing representational realism, the old plot motivation from behind is converted into motivation for a roaming space of action and protagonist interpretive horizon. Pre-modern narrative, we read in a discussion by Armin Schulz and Harald Haberland, is characterized by an extensive process of a acausal apposition, a process explained by the fact that narration oriented towards the relation between partial aspect and totality either suppresses or at least neglects causal motivations. Since older narration, Schulz and Haberland argue, and here you find the quote, is tied much more clearly and specifically to existing material, plot schemas, and motives than is modern narration. The plot is usually far more strongly motivated by final considerations, hence by the end. Correspondingly, in pre-modern narratives, we find far fewer reasons given for something happening. Rather, most events are only connected through a simple succession. Then or afterwards would here be the most appropriate conjunctions, but not for this reason. So again, we find here a limit to the production of suspense. Plot motivation from behind is not exactly what we would expect from a thrilling movie or book. Suspense emerges from a different mode of motivation. In order to hook the audience by means of suspense, a story needs to unfold within an open horizon, as I said, against the backdrop of other paths the given plot could possibly take. In short, suspense needs uncertainty. yet only to a certain degree. The uncertainty that has to be bounded, the choice of alternative outcomes controlled. The most important controlling factor, at least in the modern era, is realism. If any turn of the story is possible at every moment without any narrative costs, as it were, suspense equally evaporates. There wouldn't even be surprise, because surprise is conditioned by reliable expectations. Surprise breaks with these expectations, but they have to be there in the first place. In passing, I should mention here a certain literary genre that came up at the dawn of modernity and that deals, so to say, with an overdoses of uncertainty. I'm talking about the picaresque novel. Its protagonist, the picaro, typically a figure from the lower stratum of society, is thrown into a world that undercuts any endeavor to lead a calculable and predictable life. Consequently, the picaro's life story told in the novel is ripe with sudden changes and unforeseen turns. The rules guiding their life are dictated from outside, and even if they struggle to control these mightier forces, as they do so using the tools of the powerless, opportunism, deceit, frequently switching sides, they always only temporarily succeed. One could say that there's a disconnect between the external causalities of the plot and the hero's inner motivation. This again is a limiting condition for suspense. The experience of a permanently changing fate limits the creation of suspense. As we see from this example, suspense is furthermore tied to intention, to pursuing goals which might fail, but at least have a chance to eventually get accomplished. To summarize the results of my narratological deliberations up to now, suspenseful stories need to have a directional structure, as their elements, their knots, have to be connected in a tentatively causal way, as opposed to a mere addition or temporal sequence, while being open to alternative courses, provided that the range of alternatives is limited by, as it were, the gravitational forces that the storyline activates and implies. Furthermore, such stories need a central figure whose subjectivity is to a certain extent open to the narrator, who is behaving intentionally and pursues certain goals, which this figure may or may not achieve. All stories centered around a set of protagonists share an archaic principle, that the character to whom we relate the most, which is almost always the good actor in the story, will ultimately prevail. So the basic question such stories have to answer is, will the good prevail? In the simpler versions, such stories give a positive answer from the outset, and this structure is never questioned. In their more differentiated realizations, the final result is hidden. The process of getting to the answer somewhat stretched, and the main character whose quest we accompany faces hurdles and setbacks. The fact that we participate not only in the hero's quest, but also in the uncertainty of the outcome makes these realizations suspenseful. They treat a metaphysical question, asking, broken down to its fundamentals, is the world good? Yet rather than a generalizing philosophical answer, they give a narrative one. That is an answer depending on the fate of this particular person in this particular situation, whose perspective and horizon, and that means whose uncertainty for the time being, is ours as well. That leads us to a phenomenon that I would call the dual temporal structure of narration. One of narratology's simple but consequential basic elements is the nearly always retrospective nature of the narrative process. As a total composition, a narrative is determined by its end, which is different, I have to emphasize, from the motivation from behind in medieval storytelling that I mentioned before. Even when that end is initially hidden from its consumers, and indeed from its narrative voice. Both consuming and narrating are thus located within a double temporal order. Those who read narrative texts, observe Matthias Martinez and Michael Scheffel, are doing something seemingly paradoxical, for they take up the represented story as something simultaneously open and present and closed and past. The events appear to be past to the extent that from the start they are conceived as a closed whole and narrated in the preterite, as a chronological form in which the beginning is already coherently related to the end. It's only at the end of the reading, however, that the narrative's character as a closed whole reveals itself. While the reading process is ongoing, the reader experiences the narrated action as open and indeterminate, the precondition for understanding and empathy. As Martinez and Scheffel continue, because narrative texts are depictions of human action, as readers, we have to reconstruct the protagonist's open horizon of possibilities in order to be able to understand the reactions as actions in the first place. The rules of narrative attention guidance demands that readers, and this even applies to repeated readings, block out their potential knowledge of the action's progression and ending and synchronize their consciousness with that of the hero. For a reader to successfully identify with the existential situation and temporal horizon of a fictional hero, they will need, at least in phases, to lose awareness of the composition's closure, of the coherent mutual relatedness of its temporal elements, its inner stasis. The action's progress as a series of unspecified open moments is steadily intersected by contexts that look backwards and forwards. The progress is finally cancelled out through its embedding in a completed textual form. But this reality cannot dominate the receiver's consciousness. Käthe Hamburger observes that, I quote, epic fiction is the only place in cognitive theory where the subjectivity of a third person can be represented as a third, end quote. Yet it must be added that this anthropological accomplishment of narration depends on the receiver's side on a capacity to operate on two constantly altering temporal planes. The receiver must be able to leap forwards and backwards between the limited temporal world of the narrative agents and the free temporal organization of the narrative itself. Martinez and Scheffel describe this as the doubled epistemic structure of narrative text between the agent's and narrator's perspective. I quote again, narrated texts unite two different epistemic perspectives, the protagonist's practical level of experienced life and the analytic retrospective level of the narrator. For the reader, understanding a narrative text means being aware of both perspectives, end quote. That we are able to lose sight of the closed whole of the story while synchronizing our perspective with that of the protagonist through whom the narration is focalized explains why we are able to experience suspense even if we already know the story by heart. which means that this particular experience can hardly be spoiled. Apparently, withholding relevant information is only one aspect of making a story suspenseful, and in many cases not the most important one. This reminds us that there is not only a cognitive but also an affective dimension to suspense. The more the narration invites us to identify with our hero's sorrows or triumphs, the more we invest, as it were, emotional work, the more a text keeps its secret, even when we know the outcome, the more pleasurably rereadable it might be. It might be useful here to establish a systematic distinction between rereadable and one-shot narratives, as it were, even if it would be a complex endeavor to settle with which specific factors are relevant here, with only the latter being prone to consequential spoilers. That would be an interesting point for our discussion. A dynamic interaction unfolds between the overall frame of the story and the process that its protagonists undergo. There are lots of possible arrangements. In some, as already discussed, the preponderance of the framing heavily weakens, even freezes the narrative progression. In those cases, the plot structure might still contain moments of suspense and surprise, but these moments are put into brackets by the conventions guiding the overall narrative. The story's loose elements, so to speak, might guard their secret until the story's final resolution, and thereby cause impatience and a feeling of insecurity on the receiver's side, but they are counterbalanced by a fixed and stabilizing scheme, bringing the story to a predictable end. The fact that Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple will eventually help to convict the perpetrator is a given, guaranteed by convention. That's how detective stories have to end. The only open question is who did it? This brings us to one more conceptual distinction between loose and firm elements of a narrative, the former being used to put the audience in a state of unrest, while the latter allows them still to feel reassured. We have turned here from a typology of narratives, some suspenseful, others not, to opposing forces within the act of storytelling as such. Let me elaborate on this in more detail. We can call the two driving forces redundancy and variance. I rely, by the way, on the mentioned book on narratology. Redundancy consists in the fulfillment of a given narrative schema, for instance, fairy tales or detective stories. It satisfies an existing need for confidence in the way events will unwind. But of course, pure redundancy would be boring and would make the reassuring predictability that comes with it meaningless and dry. A narrative schema only comes alive in being tangibly realized. It thus needs variance, individual deviation from the schema, in order to draw attention to the specific story that is being told. The appropriate Latin expression here is variatio delectat. Variation gives delight. Stories grip their audience through the promise held out by the particular case, which is to say, by concealing their redundant side. They thus spark a pleasure that has a double origin that comes from a conflicted feeling related to what in psychoanalysis is termed Angstlust, a pleasure derived from the distance between an intradiegetic world and the extradiegetic situation untouched by it, and from the combination of surprise and satisfied expectations. Consequently, the tension felt by those listening to or reading a story is not only grounded in wanting to know what comes next. As I said, stories recounted within a totally open horizon of possibilities in which everything can happen at any time are not exciting. Rather, excitement results from whether awakened expectations are fulfilled in line with the logic of a particular plot, and if so, how. Emphasis on the dimension of redundancy seems to contradict the fact that the pleasure involved in narrating is chiefly aimed at imparting news, which is to say singular events. The pleasure of storytelling gravitates toward what is unexpected, not what is expected. Deviation from the familiar, stepping outside a cultural or group-specific norm. Conformity with expectations fails to catalyze conscious exertion. Accordingly, it merits no special mention. But a sequence of reactions contradicting a behavioral pattern presumed to be typical stimulates the inventive narrative spirit in order to either normalize the deviation through choice of another mental schema or render it plausible through a narrative bridge. Stories fill the breach when typification fails, a narratologist David Herman observes. I cannot discuss here with what means this occurs, but we should take note of one particular tendency of narrative schemas that seems especially important to me, the dissolution of anomalies. In the interplay of scheme and variation, we can understand redundancy as the moment of inertia within stories, which, in order to nevertheless attract attention, consistently need and generate new material. What is the function of narrative redundancy? We can refer here to the value of recognizability of narrative patterns as a psychological factor. This in turn creates reliability of expectations, a factor with strong emotional resonance. The charm of uniform plans of narrative construction becomes clear with simple literary genres that dispose of a limited number of formulas into which a theoretically infinite number of possible combinations can be inscribed. Take again the fairy tale as a prime example. Regardless of what takes place in a fairy tale and however horrific individual episodes may be, our trust in the stability of the formulaic system as such is never disappointed. The genre's pop cultural variants make use of the same effect. Something similar is more the rule than the exception in extra literary contexts as well. A contended expectation of order will offer so much protection that denying portions of reality is preferable to abandoning one's bond with a narrative that one has subscribed. Depending on the receiver's perspective, then a story modeled upon a recurring and a recognizable pattern is either just a variation of the same or something singular and different from every other version. The first characteristic can make you feel safe, while the second can make you feel thrilled. The first tells you that at least the fictional world into which you are immersing yourself accords with your worldview and cognitive orientations. The second challenges you in a way that is mostly sensuous, yet oftentimes also disturbing. Usually it comes down to a mixture of both on two different levels. One level is attached to the plot and a naive absorption into what is going on. The other level invites the learned readership, at least, or movie audience, to undertake a kind of meta-consideration addressing narrative techniques, psychological plausibilities, causal links, and affordances of the respective plot schema or genre. After having circumscribed the conditions of possibility for suspense in this generalizing manner, let's finally turn to more recent developments. If we consider the media environment of today's storytellers, we might assume that it shifts the equation towards redundancy. Every possible storyline, every generic convention seems to have been exploited, if not depleted, in manifold ways. If you look at the industrialized mass production of fiction around the globe every day, and if you reduce it to its basic patterns, you will find iteration again and again. Authors, playwrights, and filmmakers will have trouble lending their ever-repeated stories an unheard-of twist. But this, in contrast, drives them to enlarge the range of possible variations. They are encouraged by a postmodern condition, one could say, of storytelling that opens up an optionally combinable set of narrative realizations. Furthermore, postmodernism has trained producers of fiction and their public alike to bring in an amount of irony in order to deliberately play with conventional expectations. Or seen from another perspective, those expectations have lost their pertinence anyway. On a broad range, we can observe a dissolution of guiding narrative patterns at work. I spoke at the beginning of this talk about the archaic principle of narration, namely that the character closest to us, which is almost always the good actor in the story, will ultimately prevail. That presupposes that we know what it means to be good and evil, that we know where the protagonists stand and which side we are on, and most fundamentally, that the distinction between the two can be upheld in the first place. If we look at the changing nature of many popular narratives, this is no longer the case. Popular heroes who fight for the good cause are increasingly characterized by ambiguous traits. Take the case of James Bond, who in his most recent iterations has turned out to be a traumatized perpetrator of violence. Or look at the other side of the spectrum at an anti-hero like Arthur Fleck in Joker, who nevertheless demands empathy, even compassion. The secret that the narrating instance holds back from its listeners in order to capture their attention no longer simply pertains to the story's outcome within a predetermined frame. It concerns the frame as well. If the protagonist's career constantly blurs the dividing line between the good side and the bad side, the metaphysical riddle that stories are to solve in their own way becomes unanswerable. Thus, in this type of story, there is even more at stake than the question whether the good hero will prevail in their quest. And since there might be no final solution to the question of good and evil, asking it, enduring it, constantly bearing it in mind becomes more important than superficially answering it. Hence, we would have to deal with a kind of two-storied suspense, on one level concerning the plot, on another the encompassing frame of the story. This in turn has an impact on the consequences of potential spoilers. They not only uncover how things in the particular case will eventually turn out, but also cut into the tension in the double sense of the German word Spannung, between story and frame. We should add, of course, that the perpetual displacement of the frame has become a predominant generic feature in today's commercial storytelling, insofar as filmic narratives in particular are spread over a number of sequels. As a rule, every sequel shifts the frame of reference in a different direction. Thus, what I have described as a metaphysical loss of security, even in popular storytelling, is reflected in its formal arrangements too. The need to keep the audience in a state of alert in order to make them long for the series continuation. A spoiler is here simply a threat to the business model of film production firms and, to a smaller extent, the book industry. All right, to conclude, a disclaimer. As you might have already guessed, I don't know much about spoilers in today's mediascape. I've warned Simon Spiegel, but he didn't want to listen when he engaged me. So please let me know if I've managed to make a point and whether or not my generalizing reflections might meaningfully contribute to your discussion. Thank you for your attention.